Unprecedented protests in Beijing. Veterans from the People's Liberation Army are demonstrating as the government plans to cut hundreds of thousands of military jobs. So what's behind the protests and what will it mean for the world's biggest army? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. It's not often you see protesters on the streets of China's capital, Beijing. Police and soldiers discourage demonstrations against the government. But this week, the soldiers themselves have been doing the protesting, demanding better benefits. Now, the rare show of defiance coincides with the government's plans to modernise the army. It says it wants to cut 300,000 jobs and free up money to upgrade its technology. So what does this mean for the world's largest standing military? We'll get to our guests in just a moment. But first, Adrian Brown has this report from Beijing.
By Wednesday, the protesters outside China's defense ministry had gone, replaced by a heavy police presence. It's still not clear if any of the veterans were detained. Chanting unity is strength, they had demanded better government support for military retirees. There have been other protests by army veterans, but it's believed this was by far the biggest, lasting 12 hours.
They are trying to embarrass the authorities, and therefore this carries considerable risks. But they have also been careful because they never attack the authorities, the leaders. They are simply saying, we have been loyal soldiers, please take good care of us.
It was not reported in China's state-controlled media, and images that briefly circulated on social media were quickly deleted by censors, underscoring their political sensitivity. Protests in China are no longer rare, but they are when they involve former soldiers of the People's Liberation Army, whose loyalty, first and foremost, is to the party, not the people.
It's quite embarrassing for the government, for the party leadership, because the People's Liberation Army is supposed to be very loyal to the party and state.
China's military is the world's biggest, numbering 2.3 million. But last year, President Xi Jinping announced a plan to reduce its size by more than 300,000 non-combat personnel. He wants to transform the People's Liberation Army into a leaner, more capable fighting force, with more focus on the Air Force and Navy, which are both being used to enforce China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. But Tuesday's protest may mean his reforms are running into opposition, amounting to a defiant challenge to his authority. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
The Chinese government has restructured its military several times since the 1980s. 1 million soldiers were laid off in 1985. That was the largest reduction in troop numbers in Chinese history. Another 500,000 soldiers were let go in 1997, followed by 200,000 in 2003. And 300,000 more soldiers will be cut by next year, downsizing the Chinese army to 2 million soldiers. Let's bring in our guests in Istanbul. Tong, Zhao, an associate at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy in Bedminster, New Jersey. Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China. He joins us on Skype. And in Boston, Jim Walsh, expert in international security and a research associate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Security Studies program. A very warm welcome to all of you. Let's get straight onto these protests. I mean, it's quite something, isn't it, Tang, Zhao? Why are they happening?
Well, I think, this demonstration is unprecedented for at least two reasons. One, they took place at a very high-profile place, the headquarters of the People's Liberation Army. And secondly, they seem to be of relatively large size. However, I think we need to put this into context. There are many demonstrations of various types happening in China every day, and some of them were conducted by retired veterans. So this is not without precedent. And more importantly, I don't think these demonstrations were really aimed at undermining the current military reform taken by the paramount leader Xi Jinping.
If that's what they're not demonstrating against, why do you think they are demonstrating?
According to some reports, these veterans were retired many years ago. They were retired during the period of 1993 to 2000, according to some reports. And that's many years before Xi Jinping came into power. And actually, after Xi came into power, he openly prosecuted some very senior military officials and charged them with corruption and many other serious crimes. And therefore, the objectives of these demonstrations are somewhat in line with the objective of the current government, because they all want to identify and eliminate the so-called bad apples within the military organization and make PLA a more efficient and robust organization.
Gordon Chang, I wonder what you make of the demonstrations, if you agree with Tong Zhao there, because the message hasn't been clear, certainly from the demonstrators themselves.
I think one of the things is that people are concerned about their livelihoods. And this is going to be made worse because the reorganization, as announced, is going to reduce the size of the People's Liberation Army by at least 300,000. And that's a large number of people to put into the street in an economy that's not doing very well. The real problem for the PLA going forward is that its announced budget increases have far outstripped the announced increases of central government spending, and more importantly, the increases in gross domestic product. Eventually, those have got to come back into line. The big surprise this year was the small announced increase for the PLA of 7.6%. It's well below last year's 10.1% and the first single-digit increase since 2010. I think we're going to see some real problems and many more demonstrations as people are concerned about how they're going to make ends meet going forward. And this is going to include a number of soldiers, retired and perhaps currently serving.
Jim Walsh, is this going to lead to greater problems? And I'm wondering how the US is viewing these demonstrations, considering how they look at China microscopically.
Yeah, well, I think Gordon is right to say that this is going to continue and probably get worse over time. And part of this just has to do with the new realities. You know, a government has to, especially a rising power, China's a rising power in Asia, and it has to make some fundamental choices. It doesn't have unlimited resources. So is it going to be a land power, spend lots of money on armies? Historically, that's what China's done. You know, it's called the PLA as an A for Army for a reason. But the truth of the matter is that as we move into the 21st century, China's going to have to be a naval power. And that's where it's spending its money right now, on ships, amphibious capabilities, and that sort of thing. The Cold War's over. There are no Japanese that have invaded China. You don't need the huge army you once had to fight border skirmishes with India or to worry about the Russians. You need a naval power. That's going to define what happens in Asia. And so there is necessarily going to be a modernization which shifts the center of gravity for the Chinese military. And that creates winners and losers. And the folks who are the retirees or in the Army as a big social program to have a job, they're going to be the losers. And as for the U.S., I don't think they're taking any glee in this. But they're paying attention to it. Obviously, China ranks, for the Department of Defense, China ranks as the top country to worry about, the top country to watch. But I don't think anyone here thinks this is going to, wreck the Chinese government or have much impact on the overall modernization.
Okay, and we are going to talk about the modernization further, of course, Tong, but let's talk about the economic impact of laying people off. I mean, it could be up to 300,000. Some of them, I believe, could be absorbed into other parts of the fighting force. But what sort of impact is it likely to have to put these people on the streets without jobs in this difficult economic climate?
Well, I think China's economy is not doing as well as before However, I think Chinese economic situation is relatively stable. It is still maintaining a relatively high rate of growth. And more importantly, the Chinese government is paying a lot of attention during this most recent military reform to well settle the retired veterans. The Chinese government set up an independent and devoted organization to deal with the issue of resettlement of military officers. So they have invested significant resources into this. So I don't think the demonstrators we saw yesterday are a result of the recent military reform. They are more likely the result of previous cuts took place under the previous corrupt senior military officials.
Gordon, you were shaking your head there, and while you were shaking your head, I also want you to answer, who might be behind these demonstrations? I mean, do you think somebody within the leadership is supporting this? Because we know that these reforms are being met with quite a bit of opposition.
Well, there's certainly a lot of opposition inside the military itself, because this reorganization, which Xi Jinping announced, is the most sweeping, perhaps in the history of the People's Republic, certainly the most sweeping since the 1950s. There are a lot of losers. We've seen turmoil in the senior ranks. In August, 3 senior officers committed suicide, one of them a general. Before that, 3 former generals were taken down, and one's currently serving one. So there are a lot of losers in this reorganization, and they're going to strike back. I actually think, though, that the demonstration wasn't related to that. But we've got to remember that China is a society in turmoil. The political system right now is going through a leadership transition where a lot of norms, and some of them decades old, are being broken by Xi Jinping, who looks like he wants to stay on. And you have an economy which is headed to a crisis. Last month, the Bank for International Settlements warned of a China debt crisis in the starkest terms. So all of these things are going to affect the military. They've got to. And we don't know how they'll all work out. But I don't think that we're going to have, a straight line, an extrapolation into a much stronger Chinese military. There's going to be problems along the way, and they're going to be serious and severe. And we're going to see dislocations that I think very few of us imagine at this time.
Jim, leadership challenge, is that what's going on here?
Well, I think in part, and I guess I would agree and disagree with each of my 2 colleagues here. On the one hand, yes, at a material level, China does face some debt problems, it does face some other problems, but it's still the second biggest economy in the world. It continues to show growth rates that Europe and the U.S. Envy. So I'm not prepared to throw in the towel on the Chinese, but I would also say it's not just productivity, but it's expectations. And so sometimes it's dashed expectations rather than the amount of money in your wallet. It's the amount of money you expected to have in your wallet, or the amount of money you had in your wallet yesterday, even if what you have right now is fine. Those expectations can drive people to be alienated and disgruntled and lead to protests. Now, 300,000 people is not a lot of people, even if you count their families as a total percentage of the Chinese population. But I think moreover, the Chinese government, what's their number one goal? It's social stability. They want to hold on to power. Xi, in my view, is an authoritarian. He wants to hold on to power. So I think they're going to be very focused on this. Through history, there have been lots of governments that ran into problems when they made large numbers of former military officers unemployed. These are the folks who have experience with guns, who know how to organize. And so my guess is that given that social stability is the number one vital interest to China, it's going to handle how it deals with these people, the retirees and the active military people, in a very focused way. Maybe that'll be coercion, maybe that'll be buying people off, maybe it'll be playing with the social system, but they're going to be especially attentive to that because that's traditionally, historically, in most countries, a group that can cause great trouble.
You talk about social stability, and Gordon, I'm just wondering, this modernization of the military, the army, the naval forces, who's it aimed at, the message? Is it for internal problems? We know that there are problems with the Uyghurs up in the north, or is it a regional message, and possibly one to the US too?
If I understand your question correctly, I think that essentially, the reorganization is just directed to making the the PLA an effective fighting force to meet the challenges that they see in the future, which is going to be South China Sea, East China Sea, peripheral areas. And as Jim mentioned, they don't need the large land army. I think that they may be misunderstanding and underestimating the challenge from India on the border. But nonetheless, they do see this, I think, as a fundamental change in the way the military will go forward. And of course, they're making the right decisions in a sense. But nonetheless, it is going to create turmoil in an already disrupted military.
Now, regional powers have been watching China's military closely over the past year. It's been deploying ships and military vessels into the South China Sea. 6 Asian nations have overlapping claims to the area, but China wants most of it. China also has a dispute with Japan over uninhabited islands in the East China Sea, and it has threatened to attack Taiwan if it tries to assert its independence. Several of these issues involve the US, which has criticized what it calls China's aggression in the South China Sea. And a 1979 treaty requires the US to defend Taiwan if China invades. Tong, there's a fear that this area, particularly the South China Sea, has become a flashpoint with potentially serious global consequences. Is it a flashpoint?
Yes, South China Sea is indeed a very important military flashpoint. And that's why China is investing so much into building a modern Navy and Air Force. China has more or less resolved all of its land territorial disputes except India. But China has many maritime territorial disputes with its regional neighbors. And another reason I think that is driving Chinese investment into Air Force and the Navy especially is because China now has the globalized interests to protect. China is now investing much more heavily in many parts of the world, and Chinese people, businessmen, students, are traveling everywhere. So China has to have a powerful Navy and Air Force to protect these overseas interests.
Okay, Jim, I know that often it's easy to look at China as the troublemaker in the region, the bad boy, but it's part of a trend there, isn't it? I mean, you're seeing Japan gearing up. You've got Shinzo Abe wanting to change the pacifist constitution. India's also buying a lot of military hardware.
Yeah, I agree that those are all negative trends. On China, there's a big debate in the China watcher community. Is China essentially defensive? Are they more concerned about their borders than they are about projecting power and being aggressive? Do a lot of Chinese strategists think of the U.S. as the aggressor, that it's, quote, trying to encircle China by controlling all the sea and territory around it? Others say China is more aggressive. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that fundamentally there's a balancing process going on here, and that helps cause restraints. And what do I mean by that? If China makes aggressive actions, it freaks out the South Koreas and the Japans and the Vietnams and others in the region, and that leads to a natural balancing. The more China presses, the more fearful the other countries become, the more they turn to the United States for reassurance. And so there's a natural check on that. Now, obviously, we have to worry about the particular incident, whether it's on Taiwan or more likely having to do with North Korea, that then sort of escalates and goes to places that people don't expect it to go, and suddenly you're in some sort of conflict no one wanted to have in the first place. So I think, writ large, the nature of international relations, the nature of balancing behavior means that if anyone is too aggressive, the others will gang up on that country, and that's a good thing. But, mischief abounds here. It's not the Middle East. We fight wars in the Middle East all the time. The Pacific is pretty Pacific. It's pretty peaceful, but I do worry about triggers, mostly North Korea, possibly Taiwan, triggers leading to sort of political escalation followed by military intervention, and that would, completely change the scene. Then all bets are off.
And the Philippines looking more to China as an ally rather than the US. Will that change the dynamics in China's favor?
Yeah, I think that's more talk than action. That has to do with the particular president who's in his first 100 days. I think I was speaking about this the other day, and I think the metaphor for this is what happened with the Philippine President Obama, where he came out and said, well, I'm going to tell Obama to go to hell. And so naturally, the White House canceled the meeting at the UN. Well, we're not going to meet with you if you say stuff like that. And then there were sort of a half apologies, and they fudged it over, and they had a brief informal meeting, in a closed door. I think that's sort of where this is going to go. The Philippine president's going to say a bunch of stuff out, in front of the TV cameras, and then there's going to be a lot of apologies and trying to, make nice, and then we'll sort of gradually go on from there. But I do think that he will attempt to use China to get concessions from the U.S. and vice versa. He's playing this card so that he can get something from all the parties.
Okay, Gordon, with the multitude of disputes there, what camp are you in? Is this going to lead to constraints as everybody gears up from a military point of view, or will it lead them to be more trigger happy?
Well, I think, Jim's right. There is this balancing that's going on. But unfortunately, China, despite the balancing, is continuing to press its claims. China believes that it should be much bigger than it currently is today. And so, it wants Scarborough Shoal, which it seized in 2012. It wants about 85% of the South China Sea. Chinese state media is now talking about taking Okinawa and the rest of the Ryukyu chain. So this is a very expansive country. And so I can't see how you can call that defensive in any sense. And because of that, China is roiling its periphery. It wants large portions of India. And, in the background, Chinese analysts talk about taking back Vladivostok and a good portion of Siberia. So this is an extremely dangerous situation because we know that in the past, and we look back at the 1930s and what the Japanese did, all you have to do is have one incident, and it can lead to a chain of events that leads to full-scale war. And that really is the big risk right now, that China is destabilizing its neighborhood. I know that they don't want war. They would rather take everybody's territory peacefully, but that's not going to happen. So this, I think, will be perhaps the most dangerous part of the world.
Tong, do you agree with that? And maybe you can explain to us what China's policy is here, what its military doctrine is, where it sees itself in 10 years' time.
Well, with due respect, I don't disagree. I don't agree with the other commentators. I don't think expansive is the right word to describe Chinese behavior. Regarding maritime disputes, China's claims have remained the same all these years. It has never expanded its claims. What it did is it started to reinforce some of its claims with acts in recent years. And from the Chinese perspective, China has been the one that is self-restraining for all those years, watching all the other claimants building on their occupied islands. And China believes if it continues to do so, it will, lose the time because all the other countries are changing the status quo on the ground. So China, from the Chinese perspective, China is only trying to stop the changing of status quo by other claimant countries. I do think, this different perception plays a very important role in South China Sea. And also you mentioned South Korea, Japan, and the United States. I do think China has very different understandings on some specific issues, such as missile defense, the deployment of THAAD interceptors in South Korea. China fundamentally disagrees with the American claim that THAAD can help protect South Korea from North Korean missiles. THAAD, from the Chinese perspective, is solely aimed at containing China. I'm not saying that Chinese understanding is correct, but I'm saying is there is huge and fundamental different perception about those very critical issues, and we have to work at very deep level to work at those operational level to look deep into those issues in order to build common understandings. That's the only way to resolve the fundamental difference and to contribute to common understanding and cooperative behaviors.
All right, Tong, Zhao, thank you very much. I'm afraid, sorry, Gordon, we've run out of time. Tong, Zhao, thank you. Gordon Chang and Jim Walsh. And thank you as well for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Jane Dutton, and the rest of the team, Thanks for watching. Bye.